peak, Rio was a huge success. There were thousands of journalists. There were special editions of Time and Newsweek and The Economist and so on. And we've seen this in the past where you get these waves of public interest in the subject. And I think people just got kind of fed up hearing about the environment. Rio never really faced up to the challenge of sustainable development either. It papered over the cracks in the argument between the poor and the rich countries. And the deal at the end of the day was, you guys pay attention to our agenda, which is climate change, loss of forest cover, species loss, and we'll help you with economic development, better trade, and debt relief. And we never lived up to that part of the bargain, and that still looms on the international system. Third is the recession and the war against the deficit. There were huge cuts in the federal budget. The debate was all about budget cutting, the Mexican peso crisis. The Green Plan funding ran out after 3 years, so Environment Canada suddenly had a huge cut to its budget, and this thing fell off the agenda. Fourth, financial stringency also affected the corporate sector. And the crowd that gathers over there in Globe every 2 years got a little bit thinner, and the number of true believers in the corporate sector got a little bit smaller. And with the notable exception of people like Van City, one of our hosts today, it kind of got off the corporate agenda. And the roundtables all died. There's only two left. One is the National Roundtable, and the other one is the Manitoba Roundtable, which meets sporadically. The BC one is gone, the other ones are gone. And so the sort of structured conversation on these issues, which we built in between those with economic power and those with environmental interest, faded away as well. The provincial governments cut even more deeply. In my province, Ontario, the provincial government has never really recovered from Mike Harris's cuts to the Environment Department, as the Walkerton tragedy so starkly pointed out. And then we have that all-time favorite political will, or the lack of political will, and with some notable exceptions like David Anderson, Charles Catchett, a few others, there were few really prepared to stick their head up on the environment. And that's one of the, it's always struck me as one of the interesting intricacies of Canadian politics. We now have back an international survey conducted by GlobeScan, which is a Canadian firm, of opinion in all of the OECD countries. Hands down, Canadians are more concerned about climate change than the Europeans. It doesn't actually make it into our political system most of the time. We have 3 opposition parties in Ottawa who are all pro-Kyoto. We have a government here which is way ahead of virtually every other government in North America on these issues, and it doesn't actually seem to penetrate the national political debate except sporadically. And that might be an interesting, I'm sure you've all got views on this, it might be an interesting subject for the question period. Now what's happened is in the last 2 or 3 years, our world really has changed dramatically. I mean, last year really had to be the year of climate change. The award of the Nobel Peace Prize to Al Gore, but more importantly to the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, capped it off. I went to this silly bun feed in Bali, in which 9,500 people sweated profusely because the average temperature was something like 42 degrees and the humidity was over 90% all the time. And you had this interesting mismatch in which the Goracle and the IPCC people got up on the stage and said the science is now clear, this is a potentially disastrous problem, we have to do something about limiting CO2 emissions so that we don't have more than a 2 degrees centigrade rise in average temperature. Above 2 degrees centigrade it becomes very dangerous, and the guess is that 30% or more of the world's species will become extinct. That's 450 parts per million. We're now at 380, so we're not going to make that. And there was a general consensus amongst the delegates that that was probably true. They would then go back into these, not smoke-filled, but steamy rooms and spend the rest of the day arguing about removing a square bracket on page 3 or changing a comma in the footnote. And in fact, the biggest argument in the whole thing occurred over whether or not the target set by the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change for 2020 which is something like a 25 to 40% reduction in CO2 emissions in developed countries, would be allowed to appear in the final declaration as a footnote, not as a declarative statement, but as footnote number 6. So we do have, for those of us who work on this, a really enormous feeling of both dread and frustration. Things are getting worse, and in most parts of the world, the political process grinds on more or less the way it did. Now, I'm not going to leave you this. It's too early in the morning to go off and be suicidal. Let's just think about what there is to be of interest. Oh, thank you very much. Oh, I forgot my nose. I won't sound so strange. I think there are some very interesting trends going on. First, the science is now agreed. Secondly, there's been a sea change in political opinion both in Europe and North America. In Europe, the debate is on a completely different level because they've lived with this much longer. There is an active political opinion. There is an active climate control program. And European politicians ignore this stuff at their peril, genuinely. I think in the United States, one's seen the beginnings of a wave. Any one of the 3 remaining candidates will be far more active on climate change than W. And it's interesting that the Republican candidate, John McCain, probably knows more about climate change than the 2 Democrats. I mean, McCain is actually a bore on climate change. If you sit him down here, he'll talk to you for 3 hours. So, and when the United States starts to change, it can change very rapidly. One of the interesting observations at Bali was that the Chinese, who were cast as the villain of the piece because of these enormous growth in both economic progress and in energy, the Chinese are clearly on the cusp of wanting to talk and wanting to shift, and they won't do anything until the United States does. But after the U.S. presidential election, and there is a shift in U.S. policy, and there will be, it may not be enough, but there'll be a shift, I think you'll begin to see China making a shift, and that will change both the pace and the tone of this debate. There's lots and lots being done on technology. There are lots of technologies being invented in this province which could actually be very effective in dealing with climate change. The federal government has bet the farm on carbon capture and storage, which is a kind of unproven technology for capturing greenhouse gases from a stack and sticking them back in the ground. So there's a lot of hope and faith in technological change. And if there's one thing that Kyoto did, and that's what the Brundtland Commission would have said it should do, was that it turned carbon into a commodity. If you're in Europe and you have the Financial Times, you can go to the commodities page and you can find out what the price of carbon is, because there is an emissions trading system that is now a legal regime in Europe. And that will happen here because BC is part of the Western Climate Initiative, and the part you've seen so far, which is the carbon tax, is only a bit of it. There will be a cap-and-trade system with, that's not me, New Mexico, Arizona, California, Oregon, Washington, BC, and Manitoba, of all places. All of them are members of the Western Climate Initiative. And I'm told that it's very likely that soon Ontario and Quebec will announce some emissions trading initiatives.